Big businesses are snapping up family homes and building multi-million-pound developments they have no intention of selling. So what does this mean for average investors? Is this the end of buy-to-let, or is it actually good news? Well, to help you make sense of what's going on, I'm going to show you why businesses are going all in on residential property, the impact it's having on the market, and what you can do about it. So in order to understand what's happening, we need to talk about how things used to be. If you wanted to rent a property 10 or 20 years ago, be it a Victorian student house in Fallowfield, a 3-bed semi on the outskirts of London, or a 1-bed maisonette in Maidenhead, you might have been renting from Steve, a jack of all trades who makes most repairs himself, Claire, who makes a passive income from renting out the house she inherited from her grandparents, or Sarah and Tony, who'd become accidental landlords during the financial crisis. My point is, most private rentals were owned by individuals, so that's who you'd be dealing with if you didn't qualify for council housing, while companies, meanwhile, tended to focus on commercial properties like city centre office blocks. But that's all started to change. One of the UK's largest listed property companies is planning to sell £2 billion worth of office buildings and reinvest it into residential property over the next 5 years. A lot of landlords are panicking about this, worrying that they're going to be forced out of the market, particularly those with just one or a handful of properties. But does this really mean that big business is going to take over? And what would it mean if they did? By the way, if you want to keep up to date with all of the latest property news and changes to this situation, you can sign up to our weekly Property Pulse newsletter in the description. So, what is changing? Well, firstly, before the pandemic, UK offices had an average occupancy rate of between 60 to 80%. Today, it's more like 35%. Companies are doing everything they can to lure workers back to the office. They're paying for breakfasts, offering free gym memberships, and even threatening staff who work from home with pay cuts. But it's not working as well as they would like. So it's not that surprising to see them cutting the size of their offices. And for huge corporations with billions tied up in office blocks, this is a problem, which is why they're turning their back on commercial property and running straight into the arms of residential property instead. Because, hey, people will always need a place to live. And since so many people are working from home now, maybe they'll want an extra bedroom or a nice shed at the bottom of the garden too. One of the biggest companies pivoting to residential is Landsec. Offices currently make up about 65% of its £10 billion portfolio, with no residential property at all. But the company wants to scale this back to a third by 2030, turning its attention to family homes, which usually provide steady income that keeps up with inflation. Secondly, banks and investment firms used to be happy enough to sit on the sidelines of the property market. They'd lend you the money to buy a rental property, charge you interest, and let you do the hard work of being a landlord. But they've changed their game plan. They don't just want to lend to landlords, they want to become landlords. Take Lloyds, for example. The UK's biggest mortgage lender has financed thousands of landlords over the years, only to then launch its own private rental business in 2021. The bank plans to own 50,000 rental properties by 2030, which would make it easily one of the UK's biggest landlords. And it's not just banks making this move. Pension funds Aviva and LNG are also making big moves in the housing sector. Blackstone, which owns tens of thousands of homes in the US, has spent £1.4 billion on 4,500 homes in the UK. And if that doesn't sound bad enough, it gets worse. 10 years ago, a developer would buy a plot of land, get planning permission, and start building. Once the houses or flats were ready, they'd put them on the market. Some would be bought by first-time buyers or home movers, and others would go to buy-to-let landlords. The developer would make their money from the sales and move on to the next project. But this model is changing. Imagine that same developer buys the same plot of land and builds the same type of property, but this time, the homes never go up for sale. Instead of selling to individual buyers, developers are being funded by massive corporations. The banks, pension funds, and private equity firms I mentioned before all want to build, own, and rent out the homes themselves. And of course, this isn't just happening with city centre flats. Investors have realised that family homes with long-term tenants can be even more profitable and secure. So they're funding entire suburban developments and turning them into build-to-rent communities. In 2024, 282,500 build-to-rent homes were either completed or under construction. So what does this mean? Will there be anything left over for the average landlord? Well, as you can probably imagine, this is all good news for developers. It means they can sell an entire development to a single professional corporate buyer before a brick is laid, removing all the normal risk. Happy for them. But what does this mean for landlords and tenants? Well, let's start by looking at what this means for tenants. On the one hand, corporate landlords are likely to have a team of people responsible for managing individual properties. They might have processes in place to resolve any issues quickly and effectively. With resources resources, money, and maybe even a maintenance team on standby, they might deal with tenants' complaints faster than your archetypal accidental landlord who stops answering the phone as soon as the boiler breaks. On the other hand, there is a risk that tenants will become just numbers. A corporate landlord doesn't care if you've been a loyal tenant for 10 years. If they want to put the rent up, they will. In fact, they have a responsibility to their shareholders to maximise their returns. With individual landlords, rent increases aren't always a given. It goes against the greedy landlord stereotype, but we know from people who write into our Sunday Times column that many will keep rents below market value to retain good tenants and avoid the hassle of relisting. So that's tenants, but what does it mean for landlords and investors? Is there a silver lining to all this, or are we all screwed? Well, earlier in the video, I told you that around 282,000 build-to-rent homes have been either completed or are under construction. To put those numbers into context, there are currently 4.7 million rental homes in the UK. So, as you can see, there is still plenty of room for individual investors. But to make it work, you've got to be proactive, because if corporate landlords start to make up a meaningful share of the market in a given area, they'll set the standards. We've seen this in the student sector in the past, with big companies investing in purpose-built student flats that come with a higher price tag, but also a much higher quality than usual. This obviously presented smaller landlords with a challenge. Update your student houses and offer a better service, or struggle to find good tenants. So I'm expecting to see a similar shift in the wider rental market. Corporate landlords have deep pockets, large teams, and a long-term strategy. So if you're offering a rundown property and you ignore your tenants' phone calls, you're not going to be in the business much longer. The good news, at least for responsible landlords, is that not every tenant wants to rent from a faceless corporation. Some prefer the flexibility that comes with renting from one person. As cheesy as it sounds, they want the personal touch. So by offering the type of service you'd want to receive, you'll give yourself that competitive edge. However, the best way to stay ahead of other landlords and beat the corporate investors is by finding the best deals in the first place. Because 9 times out of 10, the real profit is when you buy. So check out this video next, where I reveal 7 hacks to find property deals that no one else will even hear about.